What's up everyone, I'm Eldritch, and I know that this news is not exactly new for most people because it already happened last Friday, but I still felt like commenting on the issue. So to anyone who doesn't know, Friday was a rather sad day in the MMORPG genre, as EverQuest Next was officially cancelled by Daybreak Games. And not just that, 40% of the staff at Carbine Studios, the studio behind the relatively new MMORPG Wildstar, have been laid off. And there are rumors floating about that Wildstar might also be canned by NCSoft. However, these are not facts, these are just rumors. I want to make this very clear so that nobody says, CloakingDonkey said the game is not gonna exist much longer. This is just a rumor. But a lot of rumors in the gaming industry do tend to come true, at least for the last couple of years they have, and so I feel it's an important thing to mention. Now, why is the cancellation of EverQuest Next such a big deal? Well, EverQuest Next was one of the first post-World of Warcraft MMORPGs that was supposed to be different. At least within the AAA sphere, or what you would call like the core MMORPG industry. And the reason that's such a big deal is because ever since World of Warcraft released in 2004, the MMORPG genre has been pretty stagnant. Most of the games that came out post World of Warcraft tried very hard to be like World of Warcraft, at least in some capacity, because all the publishers felt that that was the way to make a lot of money, to get a lot of people playing your game. And let's be honest, most of them failed spectacularly. A few of these games, such as Star Wars The Old Republic and Elder Scrolls Online, have since recovered a little bit, but I do feel that's also because they have something very specific to offer that World of Warcraft does not offer. In the case of Star Wars The Old Republic, that is, well, Star Wars, and it does have some really cool single-player story stuff that Blizzard just really doesn't deal with in World of Warcraft. And Elder Scrolls Online, while not being incredibly strong on the Elder Scrolls IP, is very good at PvP. It has a really interesting PvP system, and a very fun one at that. It also has a more interesting leveling experience than WoW, with all the quests being voice acted and that sort of thing. And I feel that in the end, that is why those two games managed to stick around. And then there is one other game that is very successful, and that is Final Fantasy XIV. Personally, I really like Final Fantasy XIV. It harkens back a little bit more to a classic World of Warcraft sense, so more to the vanilla days of World of Warcraft and the Burning Crusade days, as opposed to the post-Cataclysm, or at least post-Wrath of the Lich King version of World of Warcraft, which is what most other MMORPGs have been morphing themselves after. And Final Fantasy XIV also has a huge advantage in that it is following the Final Fantasy franchise. And let's face it, this franchise is incredibly popular, but not only popular, it has some very, very die-hard fans who will play practically any Final Fantasy game, even the shitty ones like Final Fantasy XIII. But at the same time, those die-hard Final Fantasy players are not necessarily the same group of people who enjoys World of Warcraft and who has ever played it. I swear, ever since World of Warcraft, there hasn't been a game where I've met as many people who've never played World of Warcraft as in Final Fantasy XIV. And that is a huge advantage for Square Enix, because it gives them a core fan base of people who have never experienced World of Warcraft and are basically now experiencing their World of Warcraft in Final Fantasy XIV. But now let's get back to EverQuest Next. EverQuest Next was supposed to be different in a few very key ways. First of all, the entire world was supposed to be made of voxels, and by that, it was supposed to be mostly destructible. You weren't going to be able to destroy everything in the world, but a large chunk of it, and a large chunk of it would then also regenerate over time. But a lot of the videos that came out and have now sadly been deleted already showed a lot of potential with destroying buildings and destroying the ground, falling down into caverns and all sorts of things like that. And in the same vein, you were also supposed to do a lot of building of structures and statues and whatever the hell you came up with everywhere in the world, or most everywhere in the world. And that sort of marrying Minecraft with a more traditional approach to MMORPGs was very innovative, even though the core of the idea behind the game was very much old school and harkened back to the original EverQuest, as well as Ultima Online, Asheron's Call, and Dark Age of Camelot. That fantastic four of MMORPGs that basically took the ultra niche genre and made it just a tiny bit less niche. And some of the ideas they had for the game were really cool, like they wanted to have a smart AI, where basically monsters live their own sort of life instead of just standing out on a field waiting to be killed by a player and to then respawn. They were supposed to spawn and then form family groups and clans and roam across the countryside and build huts and build their own little towns and then have conflicts with other groups of NPCs or have conflicts with players and have wars, attack player towns, all that sort of thing. And if they would get crushed in a certain area, they would pick up their bags and become nomads for a while and go somewhere else to try and settle. And I thought all of that sounded great, because really, I am absolutely sick of questing. I hate quests. I think they are the abomination that is holding MMORPGs down. And I think this was the first innovative idea to get rid of quests in a very smart way that wouldn't leave the player without anything to do, because it would make everything a lot more obvious. Furthermore, the game was to be about exploring and living in the world, so they took a little bit of an influence there from the survival game genre that was really big when EverQuest Next was announced. And I also felt that that was a really good idea. Combining that with traditional gameplay from MMOs could have really worked and turned the whole thing into something amazing. But sadly, in early 2015, Sony decided to sell Sony Online Entertainment, the company behind the EverQuest franchise, to a venture capital firm. It was renamed from Sony Online Entertainment to Daybreak Games, and immediately the doomsaying started, as you can imagine. And to be honest, I was definitely among the doomsaying group. I didn't really think that this could in any way be a good thing. A few weeks into this new deal, there were a whole bunch of layoffs. And among these layoffs were Dave Georgeson and Linda Carlson. Two people who were incredibly important, not just to EverQuest Next, but to the entire EverQuest franchise. They were not just important because of their influence on the design, but also because they were incredibly passionate people working on this project that required passion. It is impossible to innovate on a genre without passion. If you're just going to cynically copy another game for a lot of profit, you don't need a lot of passion. Pretty much anyone can do that. But if you're trying to take a genre, turn it around and go 180 the other direction, then you need people behind that project who are going to say, yes, we can do this, and who are willing to put in the amount of work required to make something like that happen. And so when Dave Georgeson and Linda Carlson were sacked, I was pretty certain that EverQuest Next was probably not going to happen, at least not in the form that they said. About half a year later, John Smedley, the CEO of the company, then also resigned his post. And at that point, I was pretty damn sure that EverQuest Next was just simply not going to happen at all. Before that, I still had kind of the hope that it would change into something else. It would just become basically another WoW clone. That's what I thought the entire time, that it would just be another, hey, look at this game that has millions of players. If we make that game and just put Norath on top, people are just gonna come to us and give us money for some reason, because we don't fucking understand the MMORPG genre at all. Because we're silly business people and the only thing we understand is how to take companies and run them into the ground. But then the cherry on top of this cake of poop that we got served on Friday was also that Carbine Studios has been hit with a round of layoffs, and they total 40% of the team's strength. That is a massive round of layoffs, and I'm not saying that the game is doomed. Obviously, if there's layoffs, then NCSoft is at least trying to keep the game around for a while, and they're basically cutting costs. When a company talks about cutting costs, that's always what they mean, is getting people out the door, because people are always the most expensive resource. But at the same time, it does of course mean that Wildstar isn't doing well at all. Because if Wildstar was doing well, there would be absolutely no reason whatsoever to kick a whole bunch of Carbine employees out the door. And in a way, this does mean that Wildstar now faces the very real possibility of falling into that vicious circle of not performing well enough and having its staff cut, and then there not being enough staff to put in content enough so that new people join the game, and then the game continuing to do badly, more staff having to be cut, until there's nothing left and the game has to be shut down. Now I'm going to have to say it because fair is fair, this is nothing new for NCSoft, alright? It has happened a lot of times before that they cut games that could maybe have survived, possibly, and just said, nope, we're done here. And since a good portion of the MMORPG fanbase knows what happens to NCSoft games sometimes, over the entire weekend there has been a mood of doomsaying, with people basically being convinced that the MMORPG genre is dead and nothing will ever happen again. Now, do I think MMORPGs are dead? Hell no. MMORPGs are never going to die because they're a form of online games, and online games are always going to be popular. Are you kidding me? They're the most social and interactive a video game can get. They're not just going to go away. However, I do think that this is going to have an impact on the kind of MMORPGs we're going to see. I do very much believe that we are probably not going to get another real ridiculous AAA MMORPG that costs $150 million to make, because it is just very difficult to make that money back. But on the other hand, I'm actually kind of glad about this, because if you don't have to make these huge, expansive projects, that also means that the expectations on the side of the publisher and on the side of the player base aren't so insanely high. One of the biggest problems with all these AAA MMORPG releases ever since World of Warcraft released is that expectations on all sides were completely out of proportion. For example, how often in the last 10 years have you heard the phrase WoW killer thrown around? Being able to dethrone World of Warcraft as the top MMORPG has become a marketing gag. And it's been going on for so damn long that even this marketing gag is old and dusty and nobody really believes in it anymore. And I've been kicking video ideas about this around for a while, where I just talk about the MMORPG genre because I have so much to say about it, and so I probably will do that now and use this as the catalyst to start that whole thing. But the thing that I believe above all else is that players who play World of Warcraft are not MMORPG players. They are World of Warcraft players. Because World of Warcraft is really not that much like a traditional MMORPG, and by that I mean stuff that released before World of Warcraft. Now the problem is, however, the people who have released MMOs since World of Warcraft are MMORPG developers. They kind of know what an MMORPG should be, but they have been either forced or misled to think that they should include things from World of Warcraft and make it as familiar as possible to World of Warcraft players. That is not the right way to do it. And I can absolutely prove this to you by the fact that since World of Warcraft has released, a ton of MMORPGs that try to be like World of Warcraft have now completely shut down or were cancelled, and the games that were before World of Warcraft pretty much are all still running. And the reason for this is that they are very cheap to run. And that ever since they released back in the day, they are pretty much just making profits. But games like Star Wars: The Old Republic only started becoming profitable something like 2 years after they released. And then as a follow-up, it's not that hard to see why a game that doesn't do as well as Star Wars: The Old Republic has to die sooner, because it just doesn't ever get profitable. I think what's going to happen is the next MMORPGs that are going to release on the Western market are the crowdfunded ones. That would be Shroud of the Avatar, Camelot Unchained, Crowfall, and Star Citizen, I suppose. And I think how well these games do will determine how crowdfunding is approached in the future, for MMORPGs at least. If these games are all successful, then I do think we'll see a steady flow of new crowdfunded MMORPGs over the years, although not as many at the same time. But if these 4 games do badly, or if some of them don't ever release, then I do think crowdfunded MMOs will die out completely, because the trust and the confidence in crowdfunding is already teetering. And if these games don't deliver, then that's just not gonna be good enough for the, at this point, very wary MMORPG crowd. At the same time, I do hope that the genre goes back to smaller games. Because if you look back 15 years to the first big generation of MMOs, none of those games were particularly big. They probably didn't cost more than $10 million to make, and that is probably even a high estimate. Some of them may have been way cheaper than that. And as a result of them being so cheap, they easily made their money back and then were just successful over time and could keep the game going without really having to work all that hard on it. But even then, they obviously still worked pretty hard on making the games better. But that's what I want to see again. Anywhere between that and the insane $200 million games that we've been seeing. Just smaller games for a couple of million, maybe even less than that, or maybe a little bit more, but just focused in their experience, not trying to be everything to everyone. Pick something from the vast array of things you can do in an MMORPG and do that thing incredibly well. And then maybe throw in a dash of this and a dash of that, but do focus on one thing and do it amazingly. And be known for that. Just like it was back in the day. Ultima Online was known as the sandbox. Dark Age of Camelot was known as the PvP game. EverQuest was known as the PvE game, and Asheron's Call was known as the story game. Each of these 4 games did something incredibly well and showed up all their competitors in that area. And that's how they stayed relevant and successful. As opposed to the post-World of Warcraft landscape where everybody tried to be every single thing to every single player. Every game needed single-player questing, they needed instance dungeons, and they needed a raiding endgame, and they needed some PvP thrown in there, and some crafting, and some flying mounts, and this and that, and everything imaginable. But in the end, all that it turned out to be was grey, boring sludge. There was no comparison to the original World of Warcraft. And that's what I want to see again. I want to see smaller MMORPGs focusing on a strong PvP experience, focusing on a strong PvE experience. And I actually do think this PvE thing is already being worked on. If you look at something like The Division, that is pretty much a PvE MMO. It's not for me at all, because that's the part I really don't care about. But there are plenty of people who really love it, because it's kind of like a Diablo shooter. And that's really what PvE MMOs are. Or focus entirely on story, focus entirely on world building, focus on being a super realistic MMORPG like Black Death is trying to be. There are so many possibilities for studios to just make MMORPGs that are fun to play. Stop trying to be World of Warcraft, because World of Warcraft players are not going to play your game, period. They like World of Warcraft, and they're going to play World of Warcraft until that game shuts down. And the people who stop playing World of Warcraft are either World of Warcraft players, and then they will never ever find another game in the MMORPG genre they like. That would be someone like Total Biscuit. Or they are actual MMORPG players, and then they don't want you to copy World of Warcraft because that's not what they want in their game. Alright guys, that is me done rambling on this topic. As I said, I'm going to make more of these videos because I really think there is a lot in the MMORPG genre to analyze, especially in terms of looking at Camelot Unchained, Crowfall, and the future of this genre in general. And just as it is in real life, if you don't learn from history, you are doomed to repeat it. But until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey, and I'll see you in another video.